Brother Smithey is the director of Tullstar. You should know what that is, but if you don't, TULLSTAR.org. Tullstar is named after Brother Tuller, who's gone on to his reward, who went around and recorded lectureships beginning in the 80s. We have thousands of sermons on the website. I just got a text, by the way, from someone listening on the live stream thanking us for the work that's going on here. And there's others that are watching it, listening to it. We forget about that. And, of course, the building's it's already full just of men. And then tonight, it's, they're going to be flowing into the foyer and who knows where. So Brother Light told me, he said his wife was here last night and said she couldn't tell you the difference in the two preachers, Mornay or Brant, because she couldn't see either one of them because she's way in the back, behind the walls and stuff. But I guess she thought both lessons were good. But anyway, Brother Smithey, if you will come and deliver your lesson, it's negative examples dealing with the family and the father particularly, right? The father matters, negative examples. Y'all don't have the privilege of knowing this sometimes like I do because I happen to know them all. But let me tell you something. Ryan Smithey is a fine man and father, and he's qualified to talk about what he's about to talk about on the positive side, even though he's dealing with the negative side. Brother Smithey.
Let's go ahead and go to God in prayer as we begin. Father, our God in heaven, we are so thankful for this opportunity, the chance that we have this week to come together and to be challenged, to be encouraged by the study of your word. Certainly as we look to the examples that you have recorded for us, that we might learn from them, and certainly even this morning to see those warnings, that we would not repeat the mistakes of the past, learn how to properly deal with them, and to be the men and the fathers that we need to be in the home and for your kingdom. We're thankful for all that you have given unto us, especially your Son, Jesus Christ, and the spiritual blessings that we have in him. This avenue of prayer, even to approach your throne, for it is in his name that we pray. Amen. Well, we're seeing all week the need to be the men that we need to be, husbands, fathers, whether that's a role that we're already in, whether it's a role that we're growing in. My mind always goes to Ephesians 5 and 6. Can't go there because that's New Testament examples, but you're not going to be the home that God wants you to be, and you're not going to be all that you can be if we don't follow the pattern that God set forth in his word. And certainly as we look to these examples, one of the things we're learning is how much this affects. We're not affecting just our lives, we're affecting the lives of our children, we're affecting the lives of our wives, we're affecting the lives of our communities, of our church, of our nation, of our world. And so all of these things built on one another. I honestly believe I have probably in one sense the easiest lesson. In another sense, it's hard because how do you go through everything? But I had no doubt that almost everything that I could talk about today was going to be talked about yesterday as far as the individuals. There are great men of the Bible, but we also see the negative aspects of their lives. I believe one of the great aspects or reason we have that is there's this continual reminder we're looking forward to something else. We're looking forward to the cross, and we're looking forward to Jesus. These men were great men, but they weren't our Savior. And so we're constantly reminded there was that which was better that is coming, but we're learning from these things. And so when you look at the negative examples of fathers, there's an extreme that we're looking at. There are worthless fathers in which there's nothing really good to say about. There was nothing good that they offered their family. There was nothing that they could leave as a good legacy. Worthless. We talked about Ahab and Jezebel. That might be an example that would come to mind. Left nothing of a good spiritual value to their family. No good legacy left from them. But then there's those that we struggle with. David. He was a man after God's own heart. But he troubled his family. He made mistakes in his life, sins in his life that he was going to have to deal with, his children were going to have to deal with, and many after him were going to have to deal with. And so as we look at these, sometimes when we we say, here's a negative example. That's not to say this was a horrible man, but it is to show the impact of choices and decisions of our lives that we and others around us are going to have to deal with. And so showing the importance of the decisions of our lives. There's no such thing as an inconsequential decision when we're talking about leading our homes and our families and being faithful unto God. They might have made a ton of great spiritual decisions, but a few poor spiritual decisions had a lasting impact that they then were going to have to deal with. And so that's a challenge to us. Think about the importance of even what sometimes might seem as minor choices or minor decisions or things that we don't give enough thought to, but how greatly are they going to impact us? We talked all week about the ripples, and that's the concept there that we have before us. So I want to give kind of 4 quick points and the idea of, well, why is it important really to look to these examples? And I've given those in the notes, and you can certainly look at those more in depth. But the first thing, when we look at the shortcomings and the failures of men in the Old Testament, we're looking to their examples, the first thing they did was they troubled their own lives. They couldn't hide the sin of their lives. They were going to bring troubles on them in their own lives. The wages of sin is death. There's certainly eternal consequences to the sins of our lives, but there are consequences we're going to deal with in this life as well. And so they troubled themselves as individuals, but number 2, they also troubled their families. And that's that concept again. You as the head of your house are making an impact on the faithfulness of your wife. Whether it's a good example or a bad example. Is she having to fight you to be faithful to God? Or is she able to submit as she ought to be to a head that's directing that home as we ought to be? What about our children? Are they going to follow an example that's going to lead them to heaven when they look to their father? Or are they going to have to stop at some point in their lives and say, I don't want to be like him. He's not who I'm going to walk after. I'm going to set a better example. And so these men, as we look to these negative examples, understand they would impact their children. Now, of course, we always maybe think about Ezekiel 18 and verse 20. The soul that sinneth, it shall die. They had a problem there of saying, well, you know, all these problems of our lives, they came upon us because of what our fathers did. The prophets are saying, you wake up and you take responsibility for what you're doing in your life. The soul that sinneth, it shall die. You're going to be judged on your action and on your life. And so don't blame that on your father in that sense, but understand as a father, you're setting an example, you're setting a legacy that most likely your children are going to learn from. They are going to follow after. And so these men troubled their families immediately, but they troubled, number 3, future generations. How many times do we look at these examples and we're finding the negative ripples, the negative waves impacting 3, 4, 5, 6 generations? When you look to the kings of the Old Testament, how many times do you look and we're 20 kings down or 10 kings down the line, and you're looking back and they sin like Jeroboam before them? They're going back to those fathers maybe generations before. And you're seeing those negative examples are still making an impact because of the choices they made. And so likewise, number 4, they troubled the people of God. Again, especially in the Old Testament, oftentimes we're thinking about the nation of Israel. And you're seeing the impact here that's occurring directly in the lives of God's people. We could make some applications there as we think about not just our homes, but what about the church? I think about the BCS Church of Christ and the great work that's even going on this week, but all the weeks throughout the year. But how does that happen? It happens because of the individual families and the individual members that make up that congregation. And so if I'm not the family that I need to be, and if I'm not the spiritual leader in my home that I need to be, that home is going to impact the local congregation. And it's not going to be all that it could be if I would step up and be who I need to be. And likewise, then what about in my community? Am I setting that example that my community needs to see of a faithful man of God? It all comes back again to that theme, are we standing there in the gap of Ezekiel 22 and verse 30? And so I want to spend most of our time looking at some of these examples and perhaps some lessons that we might learn from them. I'm glad that Carrie dealt a little more with Adam because I think certainly there the choices of Adam were a family issue, but headship there is certainly dealt with in the terms of when sin enters into the world, but not being the leader that he needed to be to begin with to direct that home in a right way. And so here you have the idea, of course, you can look to Adam and think here is the turning point where sin in that regards is entering into the world. Your family and all the generations after you are going to forever be compromised or changed because of the choices that you have made. And so when you start to just go to the next generation, and Cain kills Abel, and you begin to see the digression away from God, well, we trace it back to a home, trace it back to a father. I want to think maybe then beginning with Abraham. You know, Abraham was one that was mentioned yesterday again as a positive example. Genesis 18 and verse 19. You remember what God would say there about Abraham? He gave him a great commendation. I love looking there through the Old Testament, seeing those things that God certainly approved of. You think about somebody like Job and the commendation that God gives him. You think about even here as Abraham. I know him. Are we known of God? I know him, that he will command his children after him, that they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment. Abraham was a great father. Abraham set forth a great example of faithfulness to his family, to those who came in contact with him, but not always. Abraham, I would lay it at his feet, has struggled at times with faith. Here is God who has told you, get up and leave from the land of your fathers. And Abraham went, not knowing whither he went. He knew if he was going, he didn't know where he was going. He didn't know all the details, but he was willing to follow God. But there were times he began to worry. I'm going down into Egypt, and they might kill me because I've got a beautiful wife, and I don't want them to kill me. Abraham, what about the promises God's given you concerning your life, your lineage? How's that going to work if Pharaoh kills you? And not only once, he does it twice. He's going to lie about the relationship between him and Sarah. Yes, Sarah could count there as a half-sister, but she's your wife. And you've lied now to the kings, first to Pharaoh in Genesis 12, verse 18 through 20. You do it again to Abimelech in Genesis 20, verse 9 and 11. And you lie, and you're going to be rebuked, rightly rebuked, by a heathen king. That's always stood out to me. You're a righteous man, but now you're being rebuked rightly by a heathen. That's not a place that we want to find ourselves in. And so here's Abraham, because of that weakness, I believe, in his faith, as he's fled first down into Egypt, lies about this relationship. Later we'll do it to Abimelech, lies about this relationship. Well, is it much surprise then when we find his son doing the same thing? When he follows after that same pattern in Genesis 26 and verse 7 and 10 and tells Abimelech, well, she's my sister. And Abimelech's watching and she says, no, I see in that relationship she's not your sister. But he's following now in the same footsteps that Abraham set before him. And the same thing, we think about Abraham, and again, you trust the great promises of God. You trust in here the lineage, but you're going to listen to Sarah when she says, well, take Hagar, my handmaid, to wife, and maybe out of that relationship, God will bless us with the son. What they did in running ahead of God was going to forever trouble their families. Now with the birth of Ishmael, they have frustrated the purposes of God. Oh, God's still going to bring about his purposes. They haven't altered and changed that. But they're going to bring about trouble in that household because they weren't trusting in the promises and the plans of God. And they tried to run ahead of him. And so I think Abraham's a great example there of some of those lasting consequences. A great father, but the son sees the kink. The son sees the weak point, and he's following after some of those same things. And it certainly sets forth the challenge. What are the weaknesses that others are seeing in my life? What is my son, what is my daughter seeing in my life that now they may follow after? And I want to bolster that. I want to build that up, that they wouldn't follow in the same thing. I'm going to shift and think about Lot. You're right there in the same time frame. You think about Lot, and I think specifically about Lot and worldliness. Now again, maybe quite a bit more that we don't know about Lot and all the things that happened in his life, but there are certain things that are revealed to us. When Lot begins to make choices, you see a little bit of the decision process. Genesis chapter 13. Lot has traveled with Abraham. God has blessed Lot and Abraham alike. Their herds have grown so much the land's not supporting them together. The herdsmen are starting to quarrel amongst one another. Abraham in his wisdom says we need to part ways. Lot, I have every right to stand here and tell you where I'm going to go and tell you to go over there. But I'll let you choose. And we're told there in Genesis 13 and verse 9, as Lot is making his choice, and here the whole land is before him. Verse 10, Lot lifted up his eyes, beheld all the plain of Jordan. It was well watered everywhere. That's what he's looking to. What's going to benefit me? What's going to help me financially? What's going to help me in my herds? What's going to help me to be more successful? That seems to be the choices here that he is making. And so in verse 12, here is their parting. Abraham would dwell in the land of Canaan. Lot would dwell in the cities of the plain. And he pitched his tent toward Sodom. But the problem's in verse 13. But the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. Now I'm making a choice that's impacting my family spiritually, but the choice and the decision was based on the physical aspects of this life, not the spiritual aspects of this life. And so we know that account then is not done. We begin tracing through more history, and we come over to Genesis chapter 19. We start there in Genesis 13. He's pitching his tents towards Sodom. I'm approaching into that area. By the time we come into Genesis 19 and verse 1, here is Lot, who is now sitting in the gate of Sodom. This is a place of respect. He's now come to be known by the men of Sodom. And he's living here in this city. And we think, well, what of that? Well, the impact it had on his family. Consider what the New Testament says of Lot, specifically in 2 Peter 2. 2 Peter 2, verse 7 and 8, where we read that here concerning Lot, that righteous man dwelling among them, and seeing and hearing, vexed his righteous soul from day to day with their unlawful deeds. Lot knew what was going on. And Lot could see it, and he could see it daily. His soul was still vexed. He was still troubled by the sin that he saw around him. He's still here considered a righteous man. We consider in that as well that here God is going to send the angels, the messengers, to bring forth Lot and his family out of that city. But what's the problem going on in his family? Even though he was troubled by the sin around him, it's also troubling his family. And I would suggest to you that it's had a greater impact on his family than it did on him. So the things that he stood against in his own life, the things that he recognized were struggles or things to avoid in his own life, were making their way within his family. So that now as he pleads with his sons-in-laws to come forth out of the city, they mock him. They reject that invitation. There seems to almost be this indication the angels are having to pull his family forth out of the city. You're going to have his wife look back and so be turned into a pillar of salt. And again, I don't want to read too much into that, but all I can understand there is some longing, some desire, possibly some detachment that's now been formed even into this wicked city and the things that were going on there. There's some heartstring attachment here. Be careful. What are we seeking after? Things that we try to distance ourselves from, but don't recognize the impact maybe even that they're having on our family. And again, at the end of that account, you're going to read of the problem there with his daughters in Genesis 19, verse 30 and 38. City's been destroyed. Everybody's going to hear about this. How are we going to be able to have children? And they devise a plan amongst themselves. Well, let's get our father drunk, and we might be able to sleep with him and produce offspring. What's developed in the minds of those children from the way that he has dealt with this, from the way that Sodom has had an impact on them? And out of that relationship are going to spring children, but nations. The Moabites and the Ammonites, nations that are going to go on to be enemies of God's people years later. And again, there's the impact of one man's life that's going to affect God's people and nations to come. And there's Lot that's impacting his family by the choices that he made. There's certainly a caution there to us as we make choices and decisions in our lives. Are they based on the physical aspects of our lives? What's going to benefit us? What's going to profit us? What's going to give us gain? What's going to give us popularity or fame or fortune in this life? Or is our first and primary concern, what's going to be spiritually beneficial for my home? What's going to help them? And I don't think you can study the account of Lot and not see there was this drifting and possibly this growing comfort with the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah. Even though his soul was vexed, it caused great trouble upon his family. Just briefly, as we think about some of these examples, I think about Isaac, I think about Jacob. Isaac loved Esau. Rebekah loved Jacob, Genesis 25 and verse 28. There was a favoritism there in that family that fueled an already ongoing brother rivalry that was only going to get worse. And what was the impact of that eventually? That Jacob was going to rob Esau by deception of his birth, of his blessing. And so Esau is going to vow to kill Jacob there in Genesis chapter 27, verse 36, verse 41, as now Jacob is going to flee. Well, God's using all of this in his purposes and his plans. Of course, it's going to work out to what God is always intending. But what's happened there within that family? That rivalry has grown. There's a separation that has grown now between parents and children. And that same favoritism is going to again show up a generation later in Jacob's affection for Joseph, which also was going to cause strife. And you think about there that coat of many multicolored, there the affection that he was going to show unto Joseph, the anger, the hatred that was going to grow so much that his brothers even wanted to at first kill him, but ultimately would sell him into captivity, into slavery. Well, because of some of that same favoritism. And I think that's, again, a highlight of that. Don't be surprised when the shortcomings of our lives show up a generation later. The hardest thing for me as a father is when I'm sitting there and I'm getting mad at my son, and I stop and I think, he's being just like me. Because I see it, and I'm frustrated with it. I said, but I have to be honest with myself. I know where he got it. And so that's something I have to correct in me and help correct in him. And so be cautious of those things in our lives. Here's one along the same line that, again, I think stands out as a great example in the book of Joshua. Joshua chapter 7, a great time in the lives of God's people as a whole. But we think about Achan. Here we're going to begin the conquest. God's people are poised and ready to go in and take the city of Jericho, but God makes a request, a commandment of them. The things of Jericho are mine. You dedicate the spoils unto me. There's a sense there which I have no problem applying that as the first fruits of the conquest. You give Jericho to me, you get the others. But Achan's looking at the things there and he's treasuring them. And so as you read the accounts there, Joshua chapter 7 and in verse 20, as the walls of the city are falling, they're having this great success. There we are, if I get in the right chapter. Chapter 7, verse 20. Achan answered, as he's found out that he was the problem. Achan answered Joshua and said, I indeed have sinned against the Lord God of Israel. Thus and thus have I done, as he's recounting. In verse 21, he said, I saw among the goods, spoils, a goodly Babylonian garment, 200 shekels of silver, a wedge of gold of 50 shekels weight, and then I coveted them. And then I took them. And behold, they are hid in the earth in the midst of the tent, and the silver under it. I saw, everybody there saw. Everybody saw what the city of Jericho had before it, but his thoughts lingered on this. Man, that looks good. It is nice. It is valuable in my sight. And I want it. He begins coveting after that, so much so that he's going to take it and he's going to hide it. But again, your sin will find you out. And so now the trouble begins to build as 36 are going to be lost at the battle of Ai, and the people are wondering, what in the world? Why has God forsaken us? I haven't forsaken you. Go and fix the problem. You've got sin in the camp. Here's the problem, Achan. I think of all that you could have had. What you took would have been inconsequential to what you could have had. You needed some patience. You needed some endurance. Do what God has asked you here at Jericho, and the blessings of spoil of the land that's before you are innumerable. But I want that first. And I took it. And ultimately, it was going to cost his life. And it says there, all that he had was stoned. Joshua chapter 7, verse 24 through 26. How many let desires of things of this life trouble their family? We talk about Lot in the sense of bad spiritual decisions versus physical decisions. Well, here we might make the same application. Are we hungering after the better job or the higher pay raise, even though it might mean that I have to compromise some area? But maybe it's things that I just want to participate in. My love for some activity, but if it's not letting me set the spiritual example in my life, if I'm not spending the time with my children and my family that I ought to be, am I letting those things take precedent over being the spiritual head of my house that I need to be? And Achan stands out as that great example to me, that he put the temporary things first and missed out on all that was good that could have been. It's a reminder to me, there's nothing of this life that's worth giving up my eternal home with God in heaven. There's nothing in this life that's worth the spiritual lives of my children or my wife. I ought to put those things first in my life, because this life is but a vapor. It's here for a little time and then vanisheth away. But I'm looking to an eternal reward that's beyond that which I can imagine. I'm always thinking of Paul's statement in Romans 8 and verse 18, when he would say, I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed in us. Paul, you suffered a lot. You went through a lot of hardship. You went through a lot of great difficulties. Yes, but the idea that just one glimpse of my eternal home with God, I forget all that. All of that was worthwhile. that I could reach that eternal home. There's nothing in this world that's worth giving up our spiritual life and the lives of our family. Certainly, I hope we learn that from Achan. Think about the fathers of the generation following Joshua as you go into the book of Judges. We're told in Judges chapter 2 that the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua, all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua, who had seen the great works of the Lord that he did for Israel. They're faithful in that generation. But in Judges 2 and verse 10, but there arose another generation after them, which knew not the Lord, nor yet the works that he had done for Israel. The answer to this problem had already been given. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 7 through 9, Deuteronomy 11, 19 through 21. You teach your children. In both of those chapters, there's first the understanding you know God and his will, you live it in your life, and you teach it to your next generation. That was the plan, the pattern of God. But there's a failure here. There's a failure here to the extent that by the time we reach the end of the book of Judges, we have that well-known phrase that every man is doing that which was right in his own sight, Judges 17, verse 6, Judges 21 and verse 25. And that's surrounded in chapters of wickedness and immorality. That's where they've drifted to. Because of a generation that arose and knew not God, and they're drifting away into all sorts of immorality, into the pattern of the book of Judges where they would fall away from God, they would languish under their oppression until they would call out to God, and God would give them a deliverer, a judge, and raise them up again. Period of faithfulness till they fall away again. Pattern of forgetting God. A failure of fathers. And someone might say, well, we don't know exactly for sure. Was it the failure of the father that didn't teach his children? Or did he teach his children, his child just refused to listen? Either way, it falls in that generation. If your father didn't teach you, there was a failure there of the father. If the father is teaching you and you're refusing to listen and don't follow in those same steps, you're setting yourself up to be a father that's not going to teach your children what's right. Because you don't know God and you can't teach them. And so there's a failure here to learn about God. Represent a whole generation, a whole nation here of people who didn't have the same backbone as Joshua to stand up in Joshua 24 and verse 15, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. I can't control you. I'll set forth an example of what's right, but I know what we're going to do in my home. And that needs to be a challenge to us. Is that what's going to be in my home? We are going to honor and serve God. I want to think about Eli and Samuel. Here again, a pattern of repeating failures, but highlights specific failures in their own lives as well, as far as the idea of a displaced honor and a lack of restraint. Eli serves as a priest to God, and yet his sons were wicked men. In fact, we're told in 1 Samuel 2 and verse 12, they were sons of Belial. They knew not the Lord. Here's their father that is a priest who's serving God, and yet his sons who knew not the Lord. And yet one failure that's already maybe coming to our mind, why are they serving as priests? Well, why were they put in that role? And we can't say that Eli didn't know about this. 1 Samuel 2, verse 17, the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord. And those who came, the men abhorred the offering of the Lord, even those who were coming before them to offer unto God. They abhorred the sacrifice of God because of the men, the young boys. people didn't want to offer, people didn't want to be faithful to God because of the example of the priests of God? The Bible tells us that Samuel would rebuke his children, but they did listen. 1 Samuel 2, verse 22 through 25. Here's the real problem, 1 Samuel 3 and verse 13. For even I have told him that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knoweth. He knew these things. He knew it was happening. And yet there at the very end, his sons made themselves vile, and he restrained them not. He didn't hold them back from this. He didn't correct. He didn't reprove as he ought to. And even if that had failed, they ought to have been removed from this office where they were not serving God in that capacity. And yet he allowed these things to continue. And so Samuel is being told in a vision, in a dream by God here, I'm going to destroy the house of Eli. Those sons are going to die. And Eli is going to hear not just of the death of his sons, but of the capturing the ark as the Philistines take them in 1 Samuel 4. And he's going to fall backwards off his perch, and he's going to die at that news. And so there was trouble that was brought to his house because he wasn't restraining his sons. Again, we live in a generation, in a world around us where maybe, sometimes, you might hear a parent slightly rebuke a child. Oh, you shouldn't do that. What lesson is that teaching them? If anything they learn out of it is what I shouldn't do is do it where my parents find out about it. And so I'm going to do it in a more hidden fashion, maybe. Too often won't deal with the problems that we're seeing within the lives of our children, and so they're allowed to continue in these things. Well, God was going to deal with them. But Eli brought trouble upon his house. Well, here's Samuel that's growing up, and he's seeing all this, and we think surely Samuel is going to learn from this. And then yet we turn and we say, we're seeing the same problem in Samuel's house. This is what he grew up under. This is what he's known, and now he's allowing it in his own sons, Joel and Abiah, judges over Israel. But 1 Samuel 8, we read the same thing. His sons walked not in his ways, but turned after lucre, after money, took bribes, perverted judgment, and weren't fit for the office. And what did this cause? It caused the nation of Israel. I won't say this is the only cause, but it's a part of the cause here that's identified in 1 Samuel 8 and verse 6, that the nation would say, behold, you are old, and your sons walk not in your ways. Make us a king to judge us like all the nations. I think that's one great example, one great negative example of where the impact of a family had a much larger impact. Here's a whole nation of people that are saying, we don't want this anymore. Your sons are not what they ought to be, and so give us a king. He was a part of the formula there that led to Saul being appointed king and the troubles that were going to come upon with giving them a king. And God was going to tell them, look, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. Tell them of the troubles that the king is going to bring about them. But they said, no, give us a king. Appoint us this king over them. And yet we see a portion of that here because of the lack of restraint of Eli and Samuel, who did not rein in their children, did not discipline them. One that I left out of the account, and there's plenty of others, but I thought there of Manoah. Manoah, the father of Samson. And we read there in Judges 14 and verse 1 through 4 that Samson longed for a heathen woman, and his parents seemed to give a little restraint. Well, aren't there any women here that you might marry in Judges 14 and verse 3? But Samson said, get her for me, for she pleaseth me well. It's one of those things, as I read that account of those first 4 verses, it seemed to trouble them, but they gave in to it. And that's, again, a plague I think we see in our society. We don't always like it, but we'll give in to it. I don't think it's right, but I'll allow you to continue in that. Are you the head of that home? Set forth the will of God in Joshua 24 and verse 15. We in this household, we're going to serve God. We're going to do it God's way, and yet we see that failure. This is one I wanted to get to, that probably came home to me more than any others of these examples that I knew. But I think about Saul. And a charge that Saul accuses Jonathan of. Be turning to 1 Samuel chapter 20. Here we have Saul as this first king over Israel, and yet his rebellion against God, God is going to determine, you will be removed king from over me. David's been anointed as the next king. Saul knows David's coming in as this king. He's fighting against David. He's grown angry. He's hunted after David. But yet the relationship here between David and Saul's son Jonathan has continued to flourish and grow. 1 Samuel 18 and verse 1, that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David. And Jonathan loved him as his own soul. A great friendship that existed between Jonathan and David here, who Jonathan's father was an enemy here, made himself an enemy of David. Jonathan is grasping with this. Ultimately, he helps David be absent from a feast. Saul recognizes this, excuse the paraphrasing here, but recognizes this, and ultimately is going to even cast a javelin at his own son Jonathan. And in 1 Samuel 20 and verse 33 is going to say, "Thou son of the perverse woman." He's speaking to his son. "Now, son of the perverse woman, do I not know that thou hast chosen the son of Jesse?" That's David, "to thine own confusion." Who's confused? Well, Saul is causing the confusion. Saul is causing an occasion here where his own son's having to choose, I know this is of God. Am I going to be subject unto my father, or am I going to be a friend to God's anointed king? Sometimes we can create confusion in our household when our children don't see our lives lining up with the will of God. Who are they going to follow? Are they now going to follow after their father, or are they going to follow after God? The confusion there was not Jonathan's. The confusion was brought about by Saul. Make a decision that confusion doesn't come about in our lives, in our home. Rather, they see this example. I wanted to spend more time talking about David. I found it interesting thinking about David, maybe a parallel to Peter in the New Testament. One who was impetuous, oftentimes wanted to do right, but was quick to act, regardless of whether it was right or wrong. And so late in his life, the numbering of Israel, 2 Samuel 24, earlier in his life with the transporting of the ark, good intentions, but didn't at first seek after God's due order. And of course, with Bathsheba, acted upon that lust. All of those accounts bring about trouble in his life that were going to last for generations. He too was going to struggle with dealing with his sons as they commit sin in their lives, and he doesn't know how to rebuke them. He doesn't know how to bring about correct action. You have the problem possibly. Here's Solomon, a great man of wisdom. I'm not sure you don't have a little favoritism of sort in that family. Did you teach Solomon more about wisdom than you did your other sons? At the end of the book, I set forth some lessons. I think Jason's telling me to hush. Here's the last thing that's not in there that I want to think about. As you think about these examples of fathers, and understand these are but a handful. And there's so many more. Again, some of these wicked fathers who didn't help their sons at all, some good fathers, but those maybe even seemingly small things cause great problems for them in their lives. And so set forth a challenge not to follow after them. I want to suggest to you kind of three paths of your life. The easiest path from a worldly standpoint is to drift into wickedness. It doesn't take any effort. Follow the ways of the world. Don't grow spiritually. Don't help your children grow spiritually. That's the easiest path as you go through this life. But it's going to bring you great spiritual consequences here and in eternity. The hardest path you're going to follow. We didn't look at some of the kings, but somebody like Manasseh, who pursued wickedness and then tried to serve and be faithful unto God and found it hard. How do I overcome that evil influence I started with in my life? That's the hardest path you'll choose. If you could begin making poor spiritual choices in your family and then try to turn that ship about, it's going to be the hardest action of your life. And so as you're young, decide, here's a path before me. It's a challenge, but it's a challenge that's just right. Determined to be faithful unto God, chart a steady course. And you might make some poor choices, sins in your life, such as Abraham and David and others did in their lives, but that will be an easier one for you to stand up and say, I have sinned. Turn and try to make that right, but have that faithfulness. It's going to be a challenge, but it's going to be the right difficulty of our life and have great eternal benefits. So hopefully that serves as a challenge to us as we think about being fathers or growing into that role in our families.
Talk about having scriptures for what you do and the way people are. This morning, as some of us were leaving the house a little bit later than some others who had left, and you don't know this, but in my kitchen with a cup of coffee, eating breakfast, and reading her Bible was his wife. That's the kind of man he is, the kind of family he has. You know, you need to look at Acts 20, verse 7, where Paul preached. That's a Greek word, okay? Dialegomai, right? You go to Didasco, 2 Timothy 2:2, faithful men who will teach others also. I see Brother Hatcher back here before Brother Barry's big on training. That's Acts 16. Paul took Timothy. Okay, you have preaching, you have teaching, you have training. These are all different words. These are different things. This man today taught and developed, if you listen to that lesson. Just like yesterday, you two men started us off. I believe that was preaching. We need both. We need development, preaching, teaching, training. That's what this is all about. Brother Bonner, would you tell the ladies to come in so we can have a prayer for our meal and enjoy some time of relaxation and good homemade chicken strips? Yes, sir. Oh, I know. No, I know. Yes, you did good. Ladies, if we get everybody in here, we're going to have a prayer. And we're going to have a special announcement here. We want to get everybody in this way. Special announcement. But I'm waiting until all the ladies get in here. We're going to have a prayer, and I'm going to ask, well, I thought I saw him earlier. Where's Dink?